topic is on the screen, the Brickmakers of Bellaire, Ohio. If you look at that photograph, you'll see suburban Wheeling, you'll see Toronto, you'll see about 4, 5, 6 different counties from eastern Ohio represented. And the reason that they are all representative of brickmaking here in eastern Ohio is because there was extensive clay and shale deposits that were here that made it possible for brickmaking to take hold in the late 18th or late 19th century. Here's an example of what a rich red clay bank would look like. This is a clay bank that's close to the surface of the ground. This is not representative of what we had here in eastern Ohio. Most of the clay and shale that we had here in eastern Ohio had to be mined, much like you would mine a seam of coal that outcropped through the ground. These types of clay banks would have been in western Ohio, but it's such a pretty red clay. The other material that was used to make clay is shale. Shale is a sedimentary rock that's gotten hardened over thousands and thousands and thousands, or perhaps millions and millions and millions of years. But it's not a real hard rock. It's basically mud that is in layers that's hardened over time. And it splinters and fractures because it's laminated. Shale, such as this, which comes in a variety of colors, but always seems to fire red, regardless of the color, was prevalent here in eastern Ohio. But once again, shale had to be mined. It was not something that you would be able to just get off the surface of the ground. Here you see what an early brick manufacturing plant would have looked like. This is an example from Williamsburg, Virginia, one of the first places where brick would actually have been produced in North America. You can see that they have a fire built with bricks lying around the fire. That's for purposes of drying them after they've been pressed. And then you see the brick kiln fired by coal, and the bricks would be placed inside and burnt. They call that burning. Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello, it was designed by him, but it was built with brick produced by his slaves. And according to his journal, 3 laborers and 1 molder could make 2,000 bricks a day. Now, you had to get the shale and the clay material from wherever the mine was to the brick plant. And so this is a photograph that was taken here in Belmont County. I'm not sure if it's on McMahon Creek or if it's on Captina Creek, but it would have been moved by horsepower and wagon to wherever the brick plant was located. If the shale bank or the clay bank was close to where the brickyard actually was, where the plant was, you would have end dump mine cars that would be used to transport the material to the brick plant. These cars, you can see, has a lever on this end. You pull that lever this way, and what it does is it opens up that door and allows the material to be dumped. And they would dump this at a tipple at the brick plant where it could then be mixed or crushed, because you did have to crush the shale. This is photographs that would show you the process once you had the mined shale and you brought it to the plant. You had to disintegrate the shale. And they did this with a powerful machine that was run by steam engine with belts. And you can see in this photograph the belts that are running this particular disintegrator. What it's doing is it's crushing the shale material. It's taking it up the elevator to a place where it can be loaded into a wagon and then hauled to the brick plant. You can also see an early example of what a disintegrator would have looked like. Above that once they got the material to the brick plant, then they had to mix this ground up material, the clay and the shale. They had to mix that at a place called the pug mill. The pug mill was simply a big trough that had paddles in it, and that's where the water would be added so that they could make a sticky mud that would be used to form the bricks. This is an early brick press. There were two ways in the 19th century to be able to produce bricks. One would be to do it with a press, much like you would have a press today that would stamp out metal. Okay, in the press that you see here, you have a stamper that stamps down into a mold that actually forms the bricks. So this would be a press machine. This differs from a stiff mud column machine, such as what you have here. Once again, these are early brick making machines that would have been used here in about Bellaire and Pultney Township in the brick plants here. You can see they're steam operated. There's a pulley belt that operates the machine. You can see the material going into the mixer, and then you can see the stiff mud column of brick that's coming out of the machine at the front end through a nozzle that forms the brick. And then you see a rotary cutting machine that actually cuts the brick as it continues on a conveyor belt. Bricks are very heavy. If you pick up one of these pavers, you know that they weigh quite a bit. And when you are trying to move a lot of brick at the plant, they needed a way to be able to do that. And here you see a wheelbarrow of sorts where they could line the bricks up on after they've come out of the press or after they have come out of the stiff mud machine and been cut. They then need to transport those to a dryer. The dryer could be operated by steam coils, but the dryer was used to be able to prepare the brick and get it hard enough so that it could be stacked and then put into the brick kiln. Now, the next example is what a kiln would look like. These are some early kilns. You see two types, a downdraft kiln. It's downdraft because the heat goes up and then comes back down. It circulates inside here. Excess heat then goes out the flue. You can see the flue here. That would be the downdraft design. Then there's an updraft kiln where the heat is entered at the bottom and it simply goes out the top of the kiln. The whole purpose of firing a brick is to force the molecules in the material that you're using to fuse together. And in order to do that, the temperature had to reach a certain level. And it wasn't always the same temperature, because certain materials would fuse together at a lower temperature, other materials would fuse together at a higher temperature. So you had to have some way of measuring the temperature that was inside the kiln. And the way in which you did that was through what we call devils. Devils. Now we all know that if you're good when you die, you go to heaven. If you're bad when you die, you go to hell. And we know who lives in hell, right? The devil. Okay. Well, these pyrometric cones, what they're called, were designed to weep at a certain temperature. So they would put these devils, the horns of a devil, inside the kiln. And when the temperature reached a certain degree, then those pyrometric cones, or the horns of the devil, would start to weep. This is how you knew when you had reached the temperature at which the material you were using to make the bricks would have fused. How did you see this? You see it. You had to see it through a spy hole. You come up and there'd be a little spy hole that you'd look through. Okay, so early brick making history in Bellaire. The history says that the first family to ever produce bricks in Bellaire was a family called Hunter. First bricks are said to have been made by William Hunter, and they were used in Old Bellaire, which was platted by Jacob Davis in 1839. In addition to making bricks, the Hunter family went on to have a tavern and become shop owners. But it was common to actually make the bricks right on the site of where the structure was going to be built. In other words, it was kind of like a portable brickyard. The next important brickmaker in Bellaire was the Crozier family. Now here you see McMahon's Creek. Anybody know where this is? What is that? That's the football field. That's the football field. And here you see, in 1878, the map identifies the site of the Ralph Crozier brickyard. And here you see you see the brickyard here. This would be about where the home side or home bleachers would be at Nelson Field today. Now, Ralph Crozier was originally a weaver by trade, but he became an early brickmaker in Bellaire, but on a smaller scale. It wasn't a large brick operation like some of the others that we're going to talk about. And the first brickyard was established in 1869, so this was probably the earliest brickyard that was ever established in Bellaire. You see Robert Crozier here. Robert Crozier is building a house in West Bellaire. He is a descendant of William Crozier, who was one of the three brothers who had the Crozier Brothers brick establishment in Bellaire. And this house is just down the street. I didn't realize it until somebody told me. This house is just down the street from where I live. It's the home of Paul Zanakis, being built in the 1950s. Those of us in West Bellaire would know where Paul lives. Okay, well that's his house being built in the 50s. Now, if you go just a few years later, in 1882, you see the Crozier brickyard again. This is on the lithograph, the bird's eye view of Bellaire, Ohio, in 1882. But this time, it's not listed as the brickyard of Ralph Crozier. It's listed as the brickyard of David Crozier. There were three brothers, Ralph, William, and David. In 1890, according to the history of the Upper Ohio Valley, that brickyard was still being operated, but it was only being operated by Ralph and William Crozier. If you look in later years, in 1895, you see that the brickyard has been turned over and it's now called the J.A. Gallagher brickyard. So the Crozier family must have gotten out of brick making and sold it to J.A. Gallagher. And then later in 1895, it became known as the Independent Brick Company. This brick company, however, did not last, and it went out of business in 1904. Now, the other thing that isn't known about the Crozier brickyard is where they were getting the clay or the shale material to make the bricks. There is an article that was in the newspaper back in the 1880s that indicated that there was a group of people mining clay out of the hillside south of the Greenwood Cemetery. Okay, so it tends to make me believe that the clay material that was used to build or to make the bricks at the Crozier brickyard probably had to be transported in. Another thing about the Crozier brickyard, it was obviously in the floodplain. I also found an article that said that had the water not receded, when it did, the Croziers would have lost a whole kiln of brick because the water was coming up and it got up so high and then it went back down. Fortunate for them, because they were firing a whole kiln of brick. They would have lost that had the floodwaters advanced any further. But the rest of the evening, we're going to talk about the two most successful brick makers in Bellaire. That would be the Robinson and the Barnard brick companies. You can see two examples of the kind of brick that were made. On top, a ladle brick made by the Robinson Brick Company. And then you see below a building brick that was made by the Barnard Brick Company. These brick companies began to operate in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. And here are the two individuals, George Oxley Robinson, who was born in 1852, and William G. Barnard, who was born in 1813. Both of these men had similarities. William Barnard and George Oxley Robinson both started as gardeners. Barnard was hired by the Zane family, worked for Noah Zane on Wheeling Island, which at that time was called Zane's Island, and he tended his gardens for him on Wheeling Island. And then later he became in partnership with Zane, and he continued to work the island farm until he left in 1850 and came to Bellaire. Robinson, on the other hand, he began to market garden along McMahon's Creek. His father, John, had purchased land today, which is owned by the Montags on Trough Run. And it is at that site that George Oxley Robinson began to market garden and sell his wares in the town of Bellaire. This is a photograph that was taken during the Depression that shows you the land that John Robinson would have owned. This is where the McMahon's Creek bends around Tunnel Hill, and then it would continue on back towards Georgetown. All of the land on this little peninsula created by the creek was owned by John Robinson, and it is that property where George began to market garden. That bridge is still there, as a matter of fact, today. It was built by the Works Progress Administration during the Depression. And both Barnard and Robinson developed land. So both of these men had common interests in developing land which they acquired. Barnard developed the land within the village of Bellaire, beginning at the north end, at the end of the Civil War. What we know is the Indian Run area and up to where you start to get into Gravel Hill, that was property that was developed by William G. Barnard. You can see all of these subdivisions which he laid out in the years in which he laid them out. He was also very instrumental and was interested in the Bellaire Nail Works that was established in the 1880s. And one of the things that Barnard was able to do was to sell coal and limestone to the nail works from his coal mine and his limestone mining that was on Indian Run, property which he also owned. Robinson also had real estate interests, but he also entered into the ice business. We take ice for granted today, but back in the 1800s, you had to get ice from somebody who was a merchant in ice. And there was a dam that was located on McMahon Creek opposite John Robinson's farm, his father. And so when that dam dammed the water up, they could cut ice and store it in ice houses. And Robinson had extensive ice houses on McMahon's Creek, along with the Wallaces, for whom the dam is named. They also produced ice. In February of 1880, newspapers reported that Robinson had put up 300 tons of good quality ice from McMahon's Creek, and that he was awaiting another cold freeze so that he could go back and get another 300 tons. Robinson also was instrumental in developing lands west of the city of Bellaire, as well as within the city. But perhaps the most extensive land holdings that he had was what we know was purchased at a sheriff's sale from a man by the name of E.P. Rhodes, who got into financial distress, and his 204-acre farm, which stretched all the way from McMahon's Creek in West Bellaire, all the way to what we know today as 214. All of that land was acquired by Robinson, along with another partner, somebody you may have heard about, a Malat. And we're here today in a building that was helped to be established by Malats. The reason I put this on here, the streetcar, the reason I put that on there was because the plat of West Bellaire that was filed for record by Robinson and Robinson, Anderson, and Plat, actually had a trolley tracks on it. They intended to have a trolley or streetcar line brought from downtown Bellaire out to West Bellaire. And it was supposed to run up 2nd Avenue and across Birch Street. It never materialized, but you could see that the men had grand ideas. That's what they were going to do. And both Robinson and Barnard donated to churches and schools. If you look at the upper photograph, you'll see this schoolhouse, which was donated by George Robinson in Georgetown. That's the Georgetown schoolhouse. And over here, you can see a church, the Georgetown Church of God, which is still in the Church of God's name today, but it was donated by George Robinson. And then down below, you see William Barnard's donation of the land on which the Second Presbyterian Church sat. That is now where the Trinity Church is when you're going north on Old Route 7 through Bellaire. And Barnard, although he was a Presbyterian, it was said that he was a burden bearer for the Methodist Church when the Methodists were attempting to build their third church on the park. This is the fourth church, but their third church, Barnard was vitally important in helping them to get that project completed. But here's where they were different. William Barnard and his wife had no children, but George Oxley Robinson had a lot of children. And he had children over a span of time. It wasn't just he had all of his children, boom, and he was done. He had his children over a span of time. His first son, John Howard Robinson, actually went into the brick operation and was in the brick operation while George had children that were 5, 6 years old. So this was the big difference between Barnard and Robinson, was in the fact that Robinson had a family and Barnard did not. This is a photograph that shows the 4 generations of Robinsons. This is John Howard Robinson. He was instrumental at the LaBelle nail plant in Wheeling. It is said that he was there and helped to fire the furnaces for the first steel that was made at that plant. His son, G.O., or George Oxley Robinson, is here. His son, John Howard Robinson, is here. And this little guy is the last Robinson that produced brick, George Richard Robinson. So let's talk a little bit about the brick plants. You see George again, and you see the Georgetown schoolhouse. This photograph is probably from the 1880s, because in this photograph is G.O.'s son, John Howard, in the back row, right there. So this is probably taken from the 1880s. And it was because George Robinson had the brick plant in Georgetown that Georgetown was named Georgetown. It was named after George Robinson. You can see from these letterheads and advertisements that they were engaged in pressed building and paving brick. Okay, so they would have used a press machine, much like the one that we looked at earlier. And this was in 1891. Now in 1897, you can see that they now were called Robinson Tile or Brick and Tile Company, and that it was their red brick that they were producing and wanted to advertise. Where is George? How many people don't know where Georgetown is? Okay. Because a lot of people, it's not a very big place. Okay. If you were standing in West Bellaire, what used to be called Cleetown, and you were standing on the railroad crossing, where the old railroad crossing is, and you were looking west, you would be looking toward Georgetown. These homes are still there. These homes are still there today, but West Bellaire has been built up extensively since the time this photo was taken. Here you see the tipple of the Schick coal mine, which is further out the railroad tracks. And just beyond the tipple, you can see smoke rising in the air. That smoke is coming from the Robinson brick and tile plant at Georgetown. Now, if you went and looked the other direction, and if you went out to Tunnel Hill, and you climbed down and you looked from the tunnel, looking back toward Bellaire, this is the view you would see. And this is Georgetown here. You can see a little cluster of houses. You can see the schoolhouse right here. You can see up on the hill the Georgetown Church of God. And right here, you can see the stacks or the flues coming from the brick kiln, just to the right of the bridge superstructure. That's the brick plant right there. If you looked at a map, you would see Georgetown is prominently noted here. And now, George O. Robinson owns this property, and John Robinson owns this property. So George purchased this farm from J.H. Milligan. This is where Georgetown is located. This is where the brick plant is located, right in there. This is a view of Georgetown that was taken probably around the turn of the century. Here you can see the brick plant on the right side of the railroad tracks. You can just barely see some of the houses, the row houses that are along the opposite side of the track in Georgetown. Here you can see a siding. This siding for the railroad went to the Bakewell coal mine and was always also used by the brick plant. And this house right here, which recently burned, and there was a young boy that was killed in that home, if you recall that. That was the office for the brick plant, right here. Now this long driveway going up to the top of the hill, that's the driveway where G.L. Robinson lived, and later his son, John Howard, lived. Now these are the best photographs. They're not the best that I could get. They're not good photographs. But these are photographs that show the shale bank where the shale was taken in order to produce the brick. The shale was taken out here on one side of the road, and it was hauled across the road down to the brick plant, which you see here. Here you see the tracks for the cars, the wheels of the car. They were pulled there by horses in dump cars. Robinson was producing brick in the 1890s from this plant. And in April of 1891, the News Register of Wheeling reported that 130,000 brick had been shipped from this brick plant in 1 week. That's kind of hard to believe because this was not a huge brick plant. And by July of that same year, Robinson was increasing the capacity of the plant because he couldn't keep up with the orders that he had. By December of that year, it was reported that the plant produced 20,000 bricks a day or 120,000 bricks weekly. All of the bricks were shipped over the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad line. The clay, like I indicated, was hauled by horses from the clay bank or the shale bank down to the plant. This clay product in 1900 was stiff mud. It was produced in a column, and it was cut to produce the bricks. The brick was steam dried through coils along the tracks that entered the dryers before entering one of the 4 downdraft kilns that were located at that plant. Each kiln had a capacity of burning 65,000 bricks at one fire. Burning of the brick was from 6 to 8 days, and it was producing good quality brick. The plant in 1903 employed 40 employees. This is an example, and it's right here. This is an example of the kind of brick that would have been produced at that brick plant. This was a building brick. By 1895, the newspapers were reporting that the Robinson brick plant was building a 300,000 capacity brick kiln to increase its burning capacity once again, because they could not keep up with the demand. Now, although George O. Robinson was firmly in control of the company, his son, John Howard Robinson, was already being groomed as the superintendent of the plant, although he was probably no more than about 25 years old. Here you see a letter that was written by J.H.R. John Howard Robinson to a company in Canton, Ohio, complaining about one of the screens that was used to screen the material that was going to be used to make the bricks. Mr. Robinson was becoming extremely wealthy by the burning and selling of all these bricks. And so now he went into discussions to start to acquire other brick operations in the area. Brickmaking was very dangerous. And here you see a newspaper article that was in 1897 where a shale bank, the sandstone above had collapsed and it had crushed one of the workers named Mr. Archer. The other man who was injured was taken to Mr. Robinson's home until they could get a carriage there, and then they took him back to Bellaire. He recovered, but the other man, James Archer, was unfortunate. He was killed by the weight of the fallen stone. This is the home, a painting of the Robinson home at Georgetown. I know I've talked to some of you who remember that home because they told me that they remember that home. I don't remember the home, except just a very, very early, I was probably 3 or 4 years old, probably 4 years old, and I remember going to the home with my grandfather. But this was a really, truly a magnificent home. It was the home of G.O., and then it would become the home of his son, John Howard. And it overlooked the brick plant in Georgetown. This is a photograph of the home and the brick driveway that was leading up to it. There you can see the front of the home, which sat high above the driveway. And then you circled around and drove up the driveway and parked on the side of the home. That's where the garage was located. Here's a photo that I found that was very interesting. This was a wedding taking place at the home. I don't know who got married. I'm still trying to find that out. But it was a wedding that took place probably in the 1930s or early 40s. Now, I told you that George Oxley Robinson had a lot of children. John Howard was older. He was in charge of operating the brick plant. The brick plant had already made a lot of money. Mr. Robinson and his wife decided that they wanted to give their younger children a good quality education. So they decided that they would move to Washington, Pennsylvania. This is the home that George Oxley Robinson built in Washington, Pennsylvania at 112 Lemoyne Avenue. It still is there, and it isn't in as good a condition as this is, but it is truly a stately mansion. And so he moved there around 1900 to Washington, Pennsylvania, and his children attended the Washington Academy, and the girls attended the Washington Seminary. That's where he remained, and his son was in control of the brick plant, so he could go off and move to another community and build a stately mansion. Now, the other brickmaker who was operating about the same time was William G. Barnard. He had the Barnard Brick Company by 1884, and this is a map, a Sanborn map, of his brick plant that was on Indian Run. The plant lay in the trough between Rose Hill and Gravel Hill, and it was cut out by Indian Run. And if you wanted to go to see where that is today, if you go to the Francis Wallace Apartments, that's where the brick plant was, on Indian Road. You know, it's staggering. I found this newspaper article, it's hard to believe. The wealth that these men must have had by engaging in the brick operation. In 1881, Mr. Barnard was the victim of a pickpocket aboard a train bound for St. Louis, where more than $30,000 was stolen from his leather breast pocket. Yet he continued to generate wealth, you know, and continued to amass a fortune. But you can imagine $30,000 today. Think of what $30,000 would have been back in 1881. Mr. Barnard also had a very stately home. Mr. Barnard's home was in the Gravel Hill section. If you know where the tennis courts were in Bellaire, you remember the tennis courts. You remember the swimming pool down below. Mr. Barnard's home was located on that bluff where the tennis courts were built. He overlooked all of this, the nail works property. He overlooked Indian Run. He overlooked the glass factories that were built below on land that he had helped develop. Now, at Indian Run, the geologic formation was difficult to make brick. He was able to use the coal and the limestone for the nail works. So he was producing those commodities for the nail works. But there was also shale and then a layer of sandstone, and then he had 12 feet of clay that was being used for the production of bricks. But this clay it had to be mined, just like coal. It was hard. It was hard, and they had to use dynamite to extract it and get it into pieces so that they could get it to the brick plant. The end dump cars were pulled by mule to the entrance of the mine, and then mine cars were allowed to be pushed down the rails. Gravity would take them at a fairly good rate of speed, and then when they would get to the bottom, they would go up a gradual incline and slow down and then come to a stop. That's the setup that they had on Indian Run. The plant that Mr. Barnard had, he had 8 downdraft kilns under a kiln shed that was 100 by 200 feet. Each kiln was 28 feet inside diameter. Now this is what the inclined tramway would have been that the mine cars would have been pushed down. Now this is not on Indian Run. This is something I had to get from somewhere else. But this is what the mine cars would have looked like. You can see the rails. You can see it's elevated. And that's how they got the mine, the clay from the mine down to the brick plant. Barnard bricks date from the 1880s to 1898, and they were produced at that Indian Run brick plant. This was examples of building bricks, not paving bricks. Why do I make a big deal out of the tram, the elevated tram? Mr. Barnard was killed at his brick plant in August of 1892. When he walked out of the office at the tile part of the brick plant into the path of one of these oncoming mine dump cars that was racing down the rails. It caught his left leg, it ran over it, it mangled his leg. He was carried to his home on Gravel Hill, and he was told that his leg was going to have to be amputated, and he protested. He did not want the leg to come off. The newspaper account said that his leg was basically like jelly because it had just gotten mangled so bad. So finally the doctors convinced him that it was going to be necessary that he have his leg amputated. He did have it amputated, but prior to coming out of the anesthetic, he drifted away and passed. This is a map, a sandboard map that shows you the tramway. You can see it coming down. You can see the tile part of the brick plant. This is where the accident would have happened. Now, prior to him having his leg amputated, he executed a last will and testament. Okay? And then just hours after that, he added to that a codicil. He left land to the church. He left land next to the church to Mary McCullum. He left everything else that he owned to his brothers and sisters because he had no children. The codicil he executed so that he could make a woman by the name of Sophia Feely, as he indicated, as though she were my sister. So he wanted her to join with his real brothers and sisters, natural-born brothers and sisters. His death was mourned so much by the community that Mayor McGowan of Bellaire issued a proclamation to all businessmen that they should close their shops during the funeral hour and turn out to honor this important and respected man. This is a photograph of the land of the church, the Second Presbyterian Church, the land for which he donated, as described in that last will and testament. This is where he is buried, High Ridge Cemetery. You know, I don't think I've ever had occasion to go to High Ridge Cemetery, except I did go for the very first time to take these photographs, and these were taken about 125 years after he died and was buried there. Now, what happened to his brick plant? Well, after his death, the brick plant was put into the hands of two individuals who were operating it as a partnership. They operated it as the Barnard Brick Company. However, they fell into financial distress, and they were forced to file an assignment for the benefit of their creditors, which means that someone was appointed to sell off the property and pay the creditors who were owed money by the partnership. Well, in, let's see the date here, in December of 1898, the brick plant was sold. And guess who one of the people was who purchased it? It was George O. Robinson. He purchased an interest in that brick plant. Now, in addition to Mr. Robinson purchasing the brick plant, you can see here the incorporators had plans to create a new brick company called the Suburban Brick Company. George O. Robinson of Bellaire, a Mr. Hodgman of Moundsville, a Mr. Weed of Wheeling, and a Mr. Carpenter of Martins Ferry. All of these men owned brick plants in their respective communities. And rather than compete with each other in the future, they decided that it would be best to consolidate their companies into one company called the Suburban Brick Company. Now, when they did this, it was organized as a West Virginia corporation, and an article in the Clay and Brick Journal, which I have up here, talks about the Suburban Brick Company because it was going to be a great company. The plant in Martins Ferry became Suburban Plant Number 1. The plant at Georgetown that was owned by Robinson became Suburban Plant Number 3. The Barnard plant became Suburban Number 2. And the Moundsville plant became Factory 4. So all of the men donated this in exchange for stock in the new company. They immediately began producing pavers. Suburban Wheeling Block is what's stamped on them. We have some up here, I think right there. It's a misnomer. Those bricks were not produced in Wheeling. They were produced in Bellaire, Ohio. Probably at the Barnard or at the Robinson brick plants that were a part of Suburban Brick. Now, G.O. Robinson, during this period of time, was moving to Washington, Pennsylvania. Okay, so he was moving out of the area. However, he would continue to act in the management of the Suburban Brick Company for just a very short time, and then he decided to sell off his interest in the Suburban Brick Company to the remaining stockholders. The reason that he did that is most likely because he had eyes on another brick plant at McLeansville, which was incorporated in 1900 as the Standard Stone and Brick Company. Mr. Robinson, G.O. Robinson, and others purchased the McLean stone quarry along McMahon's Creek, which was just 1 mile further west from the Georgetown plant, which was now being operated by Suburban. The reason that they bought this was because there was a rich deposit of clay that was lying below the sandstone that the McLeans had already taken off of the property. If you look at the geologic formation, you see the sandstone here. That sandstone had already been removed by the McLeans. Some of that sandstone went to the Belmont County Courthouse, which is now being renovated and resurfaced. But look at what's below the 8 feet of sandstone. 11 feet of clay shale, 3 feet of clay, nodular limestone, reddish brown clay, 2 feet, 3 feet of a bluish gray sandy shale, then reddish brown shale, then 20 feet of gray sandy shale, and then below that 4 feet of clay shale. There was over 40 feet of usable material that could be used to make bricks. So, obviously it was a wise decision to purchase this property because it was ideally suited for a brick plant. Now, his son, John Howard Robinson, who you see here, he was the superintendent at the Georgetown plant when Suburban bought it. Okay, well, he now became the superintendent of the Standard Stone and Brick plant just 1.5 miles beyond the Georgetown plant. Here's a picture of the new brick company office, Standard Stone and Brick Company in Bellaire, located at 336 33rd Street. Standing at the entrance, you see John Howard, you see George, his father, and you see Mr. Bradfield, who has but one leg, who was the bookkeeper for the company. Now, we want to look at the map again because here's where the Suburban Brick Company is trying to operate the old Robinson Brick and Tile plant. Here is where the Standard Stone and Brick Company has now decided to begin to operate a brick factory. You have some idea what happened? This is a picture of the Standard Stone and Brick plant. This is a winter picture. You can see all the kilns, you see the flues, you see the drying houses. It was a big operation. Anybody have an idea how Suburban felt about that? Suburban didn't like it a bit because Mr. Robinson had sold his stock back to them, and now he was operating another brick plant which was in direct competition. They were producing these pavers, and Suburban was producing those pavers. They were basically the same kind of brick product. Because it was in direct competition, litigation was filed. There was a lawsuit filed by the Suburban Brick Company against Mr. Robinson, and the purpose of the lawsuit was to enforce a clause that said there would be no competition by any of those who had donated their brick factories to the new Suburban Company in exchange for stock. Okay, this is what the non-competition clause said. It imposed 2 requirements. A geographic requirement of 50 miles of Wheeling, West Virginia, and a time period of 10 years. The court ruled against Mr. Robinson, ordered him to quit his interest in the Standard Stone and Brick Company until 1908. And so he was in Washington, Pennsylvania, and so most likely he was distant enough from the operation that there was never any questions. But he also had other interests here in Bellaire that kept him in close contact and communication with family and with Bellaire. He was the president of the Eastern Ohio Milling Company. And here is a photograph of that milling company that when it was destroyed by fire, it would be directly across the street from Mr. Kramer's Paul J. Associates. That's a photograph when it was destroyed by fire in 1914. He also was a director of the First National Bank in Bellaire. So he had a lot of business interests. After his children graduated from the Washington Seminary and the Academy, it was determined that he would move back to Bellaire. So in 1911, his children's education being completed and the injunction against him now no longer being in effect, he moved back to Bellaire and took up residence in a home at 4835 North Guernsey Street, in this home right here. This was Alice Malek's house, 4815. This was the home last occupied by Bill Dunaway before the home was taken by the highway. This is a description from the family. One of the Cowan family members, descended from the Robinsons, said, "The house had 3 stories. The first floor comprised of a kitchen, pantry, library, dining room, parlor, and large entry hall." This is the large entry hall. The second floor had 3 bedrooms across the front, a large bedroom, bath, and maid room. The third floor had 2 large rooms. This is the living area that you see here. This is the bathroom that's upstairs. The reason I put that in there was because, can you imagine carrying that up to the second floor of that home? And the old commode is still there. This was taken just before the home was torn down for State Route 7 construction. The extensive land holdings that Mr. Robinson had extended all the way up to 214. And it included what was, now we know, was Overlook Court. This is a summer home from a photograph that was taken. It actually is a log cabin, and it was, you can see here that there must have been some siding that was put on it, but you can still see here in the rear corner, the log home construction. And that was there. There were some other summer homes that were there as well. Some of these homes were actually occupied by family members. This is the home that was constructed by Mr. Robinson in the late 1920s. And he moved from 4835 Guernsey Street to this home on Overlook Court. That home is still there today. It's situated on Lot 20. If you drive up to Overlook Court, and you drive in the entrance coming from Bellaire, it'll be the second home on the left-hand side. You'll see that home there today. This is what it looks like today. That's what it looks like today. Now, Mr. Robinson passed away in 1928, in 1928. The photo that you see there was taken a year before he died. That's in the home there on Overlook Court. What's interesting to me was the headline. He was no longer known as a brickmaker. Now he was known as a realtor. And that's probably because of the extensive land holdings that he had throughout Bellaire and Pultney Township. He was buried in the old Rock Hill Cemetery. Here you can see 1852 to 1928. That's the tombstone where he would be buried. This is not in the new part of the Rock Hill Cemetery. This is in the very old part. His last will was admitted to probate in Belmont County. He had amassed quite a bit of money over the years. He passed away in Florida, and he was brought back. He had a touring car that was down there that had to be brought back. So his will provided for a trust. It was known as the Robinson Trust. And during the next 20 years, while his estate, decedent's estate, was open, there was extensive sales of real estate by his executors. There was then a creation of the Robinson Trust outside of the probate court jurisdiction, and there was property sold from that trust. So for 80 years after his death, real estate was still being sold out of the Robinson Trust. There were hundreds of real estate transfers made by his widow and by the trustees for building purposes. I would venture to say, how many people live in West Bellaire? Okay, if you live in West Bellaire, then you live in property that was owned by Geo Robinson and made available for building lots. John Howard Robinson, after the death of Geo, continued to operate or be involved in the operation of the Standard Stone and Brick Company until he had suffered a stroke and then he was no longer able to continue. Redtown, I have to talk about Redtown at least a little bit, because Redtown was a little, just a small row of houses that was at the McLeansville site of the Standard Stone and Brick Company, where individuals lived and oftentimes worked right at the brick plant. This is an example of one of those homes, and I was told that this home was the home of Ed and Roxy Williams. I don't know who Ed and Roxy are, but that was their home. And this young lady, Ethel Myers Moore, standing in front of the brick kilns, and you can see the flue there. These are some photographs of the extensive clay pit. Anybody who's been to McLeansville to fish knows that fishing is very good, or was very good. I don't know whether it still is or not. But the reason why that clay pit is there is because as the bricks were produced, the clay was excavated down 40-some feet to take the material out of the ground for making the bricks, and it had to be constantly pumped out. Well, when they weren't producing bricks, then the clay pit would fill up with water. And this is a view of the brickyard. You see the kilns, and here you see the water, the extensive water. Here is another picture that you can see the clay bank and the shale bank, where they had moved up to this point. That's how high the high wall was, where they were actually excavating the clay and shale. Here's a photograph that was taken probably early 1940. Three guys hanging out with each other out there on the sandstone that came down after they had excavated the clay. You can see the water in the clay pit. Behind them, you see the mill, the mixing mill, the pug mill. You see some of the flues. Okay, and here you see the water tank where the water was sent down to the pug mill high up on the bank there. We've got examples of some of these bricks up here, but just very quickly, this is a scratch brick. This is a building brick. You probably see it in a lot of fireplaces. This is a common brick, both of which were produced by Standard Stone. Here are the paving bricks. SS&B, Standard Stone and Brick Company, Bellaire Block, Standard Bellaire Block. Here's a picture of the last family that resided in the old mansion on top of the hill overlooking Georgetown, the Cowan family. And behind them, what do you see? But you see that scratch brick fireplace. I've got one in my house. I'm sure there's others that have the same fireplaces in theirs as well. We even have a relative that is in California that took home with her a standard stone and brick company Bellaire block so that she could put it in her fireplace at her home in California. Here's a home for sale in West Bellaire, $110,000. It's made out of Robinson scratch brick. Here's a garage in West Bellaire made out of standard stone and brick, common brick. This is a photograph of the family that last was engaged in operating the standard stone and brick company in McClemsville. You see George Richard Robinson. That's the little boy that was on the lap of the photograph of the 4 generations, and his wife Neva, and their daughters Nancy, Sue, and Peggy. This was their home on 4th Avenue in West Bellaire. It's still there, occupied by Lillian Hepburn. This is the only thing that remains of the Standard Stone and Brick Company, except for the clay pit, which actually is not the same clay pit that it was in the days when I remember it. But this was the scale house, and it was used as an office and a scale house, and that's all that's left. But it's made with standard stone and brick. You go out there, and well, you're not allowed to go out there, but if you did go out there with permission, you'd be able to find standard stone and brick all over the place. I'd like to thank some people who helped me put a lot of this information together. I first of all would like to thank my mother, Nancy Robinson Frizzi, who is a great granddaughter of George Oxley, Philip Cowan, who's a great grandson, Carol Cowan Gerges, a great granddaughter, Christine Robinson Lentz, who put the brick in her fireplace in California. And I'd like to thank the Croziers, Colleen, Connie, and Robert out west, who helped me with gathering some of the information on the Crozier family, and then all of these other folks that are listed there. And to close, I'm going to leave you with the advice that my father gave me. He said, you never throw away a good brick. It still has many uses. So tonight, I'd like to have a drawing. I'd like somebody to win 2 bricks. One will be a Barnard brick, and the other one is going to be a standard stone and brick company. Thank you very much.